Hello, and welcome to the Intuitive Ouija. Thanks for clicking on my story. Before we begin, drop your city or country in the comments. I'm curious where in the world you're listening from. The city stretched out below us, a grid of ambition lit in cold, electric white and frantic yellow. A billion windows, each holding a sliver of someone else's dream or demise. And from the 47th floor of Liam's Battery Park apartment, we were the gods looking down on our own personal Olympus, the air smelling of expensive bourbon, lemon zest from the craft cocktails Sophia was mixing, and the faint, sterile scent of central air conditioning that money so effortlessly provides. We were five, a constellation of young fortune, orbiting the same lucrative sun. There was Liam, the FX wizard whose quick-fire trades could make a small nation's treasury wince, his confidence as vast as the living room view. Sophia, sharp and serene in equities, her analytical mind a scalpel disguised by a warm, almost maternal smile. Mark, our resident quant, a man who spoke more fluently in Python than in English. His world a beautiful matrix of numbers and probabilities where human emotion was just an irritating variable to be normalized. Chloe, from mergers and acquisitions, all fierce ambition and designer heels, who could charm a boardroom or eviscerate a competitor with the same unnerving grace. And then there was me, Alex, a vice president in asset management, the storyteller of the group, the one who tried to weave narratives around the cold, hard data, a skill I prided myself on even as I dismissed anything that couldn't be charted on a Bloomberg terminal. We had just closed a monstrous quarter, the kind that fuels legends and buys second homes in the Hamptons, and the buzz in the room was a tangible thing, a vibration of pure, unadulterated success that made the ice cubes in our glasses clink in solidarity. The conversation was a familiar symphony of shop talk. The Fed's dovish tilt, the overvaluation in the tech sector, the upcoming IPO of a promising biotech firm. A language of power that made us feel invincible, insulated from the mundane worries of the world below. It was Chloe who produced the box, a flat, rectangular thing she'd pulled from the back of her hall closet with a theatrical flourish, its lid illustrated with a mock sinister moon and stars. A housewarming gift from my aunt, she declared, placing it on the sleek, minimalist coffee table amidst the artisanal cheese board and the half-empty bottles of Blanton's. She said every home needs a bit of old-world charm. It was a Ouija board, of course, the Parker Brothers version, the plastic planchette rattling inside like a loose tooth. We erupted in the predictable chorus of cynical laughter, a sound that bounced off the floor-to-ceiling windows. Old-world charm? Liam scoffed, swirling his bourbon. More like old-world nonsense. My models have a better chance of predicting the future than that piece of cardboard. Mark picked up the planchette, examining it with a quant's disdain for imprecision. It's the ideomotor effect, he stated, as if reading from a textbook. Involuntary muscle movements. The brain fooling itself. It's statistically insignificant. But the bourbon was working its magic, and the sheer irony of it, the absolute absurdity of five masters of the rational universe engaging with such a blatant symbol of superstition, was too delicious to resist. It was Sophia, ever the pragmatic one, who said, "Oh, come on, it'll be a laugh. Let's ask it something relevant. What's the S&P going to do next week?" And so, with a collective shrug of condescending amusement, we gathered around the table, the city's skyline our silent witness. Our fingers, manicured, calloused from gripping a mouse for 12 hours a day, adorned with signet rings or simple platinum bands, found their places lightly on the heart-shaped planchette. The mood was still light, jocular. "Is anyone there?" Liam asked in a mock serious voice, earning a snort from Chloe. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a tremor. It was faint at first, a hesitant drift toward the corner of the board marked NO. We all laughed, accusing each other of pushing. "See? Inefficient market," Mark quipped. But then Sophia, her voice losing its playful edge, asked, "What's the biggest threat to our portfolio?" The air in the room seemed to shift, growing heavier, as if the central air had suddenly been switched off. The planchette began to move again, but this time it was different. It wasn't the lazy, drunken wobble of before. It was a deliberate, purposeful glide. It moved with an unnerving certainty, a smooth, almost mechanical precision that made the fine hairs on my arm stand up. It went straight to the letters. A, then C, then M, then E, ACME. A silence fell, so profound I could hear the hum of the sub-zero refrigerator in the kitchen. ACME Corporation. It wasn't just any ticker, it was our golden goose, the cornerstone of our firm's most aggressive growth fund. A tech darling that had defied gravity for 18 straight months. A stock we had all personally ridden to substantial bonuses. My own year-end, a number I'd already mentally allocated to a new Porsche 911, was tied to its continued ascent. Funny, Chloe said, her voice tight. Very funny. Who's doing that? But no one admitted to it. Our eyes met around the table, and in each pair, I saw a flicker of the same unease, quickly masked by bravado. Liam tried to laugh it off. Must be a short seller in our midst. But the planchette wasn't finished. It dragged our fingers back to the center, and then resumed its grim trajectory. CRASH crash. The word hung in the air between us, a four-letter obscenity in our world. The planchette came to a dead stop, as if the energy propelling it had been abruptly cut. We all pulled our hands back as if burned. The cynical spell was broken. Okay, that's enough, Mark said, his voice unusually sharp. This is stupid. He grabbed the board and shoved it back into its box. The rest of the evening was a forced affair. The conversation turned back to work, to deals and projections, but the easy arrogance was gone, replaced by a strained effort to ignore the elephant in the room. I found myself watching David, our quiet compliance officer, who'd joined us later in the evening. He hadn't been part of the seance, but he'd been watching from the bar, a faint, unreadable expression on his face. David was a careful man, thorough to a fault, the human safeguard against our collective greed. I remembered him mentioning, almost in passing a few weeks ago, a minor anomaly he'd seen in a footnote deep within Acme's last quarterly filing. Something about related party transactions with a shell company in the Caymans. He'd brushed it off himself, saying it was probably nothing, just aggressive accounting, but the memory of his furrowed brow surfaced now, unbidden. I dismissed it just as quickly. Aggressive accounting was the lifeblood of Wall Street. The next morning, the Ouija board was a hazy memory, a bizarre footnote to a night of heavy drinking. We were back in our element, the world of concrete numbers and rational analysis. The trading floor was its usual cacophony of ringing phones, blaring news feeds, and the frantic energy of billions of dollars in motion. I was deep in a valuation model for a potential acquisition when I felt the shift. It started as a whisper, a low murmur that rippled across the rows of desks. Then a phone slammed down. Then another. My own Bloomberg terminal chirped with an urgent news alert. I clicked it open, and my stomach dropped through the floor. The headline was stark, brutal. ACME Corp CEO under investigation for massive accounting fraud. Whistleblower alleges falsified revenue. The details were damning. The shell company in the Caymans David had mentioned wasn't just aggressive accounting. It was a fabricated entity used to inflate sales figures by hundreds of millions. The stock, which had opened slightly down on unrelated market jitters, went into freefall. It wasn't a slide, it was a cliff dive. The ticker tape at the bottom of my screen was a blur of red, the numbers for ACME scrolling down so fast they were almost unreadable. Halted. The word flashed next to the symbol. Trading had been suspended. Panic is a quiet thing on a trading floor at first, a vacuum where sound should be, before it erupts into chaos. I looked up from my screen and saw Liam, his face pale, staring blankly at his monitors. Across the aisle, Chloe was on the phone, her voice a low, furious hiss. And then I saw David. He was standing by the window, not looking at any screen, just staring out at the city, his shoulders slumped. The memory of the previous night crashed over me with the force of a physical blow. The smooth, deliberate glide of the planchette. Acme. Crash. It wasn't a prediction. It wasn't a ghost or a demon or a cosmic joke. The Ouija board predicted a stock market crash. We should have sold. The thought was a scream inside my head. But the real horror, the truly chilling revelation that settled into my bones like a deep frost, was dawning on me as I watched David's reflection in the glass. His suppressed professional anxiety, the gut feeling he'd rationalized away because the numbers looked too good, the tiny red flag he'd seen and buried under a mountain of logical excuses. It had been there all along, a secret knowledge festering in his subconscious. And in that darkened room, with our fingers resting on that stupid piece of plastic, his unconscious mind, the part that knew the truth his conscious self refused to acknowledge, had hijacked the game. Our collective muscle tremors, our slight, involuntary movements, had been guided not by spirits, but by one man's unspoken dread. The planchette was just a cursor, and David's subconscious was the mouse. A gut feeling we all ignored cost us everything. The bonuses, the Porsche, the unshakable belief in our own infallibility. It all evaporated in that instant of devastating clarity. We had been brought down not by a market correction or a bad bet, but by a truth so inconvenient that it could only express itself through a child's toy. A truth that proved that even in our world of cold, hard logic, the most dangerous force, the most accurate predictor, wasn't a complex algorithm, but the quiet, terrifying whisper of a human instinct that knew better. And as I sat there, watching the digital representation of our wealth disintegrate in a blaze of red, I understood that the most haunting thing about the entire experience was that the ghost in the machine had never been in the board at all. It had been sitting right there with us, silent, terrified, and all too human. The silence that followed the crash was not the absence of sound, but a new, heavier kind of noise. The deafening hum of lost potential, of futures that had been so tangible just hours before now receding into the bleak fog of what-ifs and if-onlys. The office that was once a cathedral of ambition now felt like a mausoleum for our collective hubris. And we moved through the remaining hours of that day like ghosts haunting the scene of our own financial demise, each of us trapped in the private hell of calculating the exact dimensions of the loss, the bonus number that had been a certainty now a gaping zero, a negative space that seemed to swallow the very light from the room. I couldn't bring myself to look at David for long. Every glance feeling like an accusation I had no right to make, because the truth was we were all complicit. We had all ignored the faint, acrid smell of smoke because the fire was warming us so beautifully. But seeing him, hunched over his desk pretending to review documents he wasn't actually reading, was like staring at the source of the spark, the human flaw in our perfect system, and the knowledge was a corrosive acid in my gut. The official post-mortem was a brutal, clinical affair. A conference room meeting where senior partners with faces of granite dissected the failure with the cold precision of pathologists, using terms like liquidity event and catastrophic devaluation to describe the evisceration of our fund, and we, the junior gods, sat in silence, absorbing the blame that was never directly spoken but hung in the air thicker than the expensive cigar smoke that usually lingered in that room. Our careers, once on a rocket trajectory, now permanently scarred, our names whispered with a mixture of pity and scorn, the team that bet the farm on a phantom. The party, the board, the prediction, it became an unspoken taboo, a secret so bizarre and professionally damaging that to mention it would be to admit a crack in our rational facades that was wider than any of us could bear. So we simply never spoke of it again, a pact sealed not with words but with shared, terrified understanding. In the weeks that followed, the group fractured, the bonds of camaraderie forged in bull markets proving brittle under the first real pressure. Liam became bitter and withdrawn, his trades turning reckless. Sophia transferred to a quieter desk in London. A move that felt like a retreat. Chloe doubled down on her ambition, her smile now a weapon, her eyes colder, and Mark buried himself ever deeper in his algorithms, trying to build a model that could factor out the unpredictable variable of human fallibility. And me, I stayed in my office, watching the markets churn, but the thrill was gone, replaced by a constant, low-level anxiety, a nagging sense that the numbers on the screen were just a fragile veneer over a seething, subconscious ocean of fear and intuition that could never be quantified. I started seeing patterns everywhere, not in the charts, but in the slight hesitations of CEOs during earnings calls, in the overly careful wording of press releases, in the way a colleague might avoid eye contact when discussing a particular holding, and I understood that the Ouija board had taught me the most valuable and terrifying lesson of my career. That the market isn't driven by data alone, but by the collective, often suppressed, gut feelings of millions of people, a vast unseen current of hope and dread that no algorithm could ever truly capture. The planchette never moved for me again, but I feel its ghostly pressure every time I place a trade, a reminder that the most significant crashes aren't charted on a screen, but are born in the quiet, rationalized away anxieties of men like David, men like me, who chose to believe the story we were selling until the very moment it collapsed under the weight of a truth that had been trying to spell itself out all along. The ghost of that night became a permanent resident in my psyche, a silent partner in every decision I made, its presence a cold spot in the fervor of the trading floor, a constant whisper at the back of my mind that questioned every bullish signal and saw omens in every minor correction, turning my once instinctive confidence into a halting, second-guessing paralysis where I would hold my finger over the execute button for a beat too long, the phantom sensation of that smooth plastic planchette under my fingertips, a visceral reminder of how easily certainty could be guided by unseen forces. I found myself obsessively reading the footnotes of financial statements, not with Mark's quantifiable scrutiny, but with a detective's paranoid eye, searching for the hidden narrative, the ghost in the machine, the single, seemingly innocuous detail that could unravel an entire empire, just as David's suppressed observation had done. And in doing so, I became a less effective banker but a more haunted man, seeing potential acmes in every promising startup and every blue-chip stalwart, my professional judgment clouded by the chilling understanding that the foundation of our entire economy was built not on bedrock, but on the shifting sands of collective belief and the terrifying power of a secret everyone knows but no one speaks. The cityscape outside my window, once a map of infinite opportunity, now looked like an intricate circuit board waiting for a short, each glittering light a potential point of failure, and I would sometimes catch my reflection in the glass at night, superimposed over the skyline, and see not a master of the universe, but a man desperately trying to read the patterns in the chaos, just as we had tried to read the letters spelled out on that childish board, realizing that the real market crash wasn't a single event that happened and then was over, but a continuous, slow-motion collapse of faith that happened one rationalized doubt at a time, a silent crash that occurred in the quiet moments before the headlines hit, in the gut of a cautious man who chose to ignore his own unease. And it was this endless, invisible crash that I was now doomed to bear witness to every single day, a prisoner of the knowledge that the most accurate predictor in the world of high finance was not a complex algorithm, but a cheap piece of cardboard and the terrifying truth of what we already know but refuse to admit. Years have bled into one another since that night. The sharp edges of the financial loss have dulled into a manageable scar, a line item in the long ledger of a career, but the psychological wound remains raw, an open nerve that twinges with every market tremor, a permanent alteration of my perception that has made me wealthy in a different, more isolated way, a kind of Cassandra of capital who sees the cracks in every foundation, but whose warnings are always too vague, too rooted in a discredited past to be acted upon. I left the frenetic pace of the fund eventually, moving to a quieter role in private wealth management, where the stakes are personal and the timelines are long, and I now sit with couples planning their retirements or heirs managing their legacies, and I listen, truly listen, not just to their stated goals and risk tolerances, but to the hesitations in their voices, the unspoken fears they bury under talk of diversification and asset allocation. And I have become an expert in reading the subtle tremors of the human planchette, the slight pressure of a suppressed anxiety about healthcare costs or a child's spending habits. And I build portfolios that are not just mathematically sound, but psychologically fortified, because I understand now that a financial plan is only as strong as the client's faith in it. And that faith is a fragile thing, easily shattered by a single unforeseen truth. I heard through the grapevine that David never recovered. He left the industry altogether, reportedly suffering from a kind of breakdown which makes a terrible, poetic sense. He was the vessel for the truth, and the truth broke him, while the rest of us, merely the conduits, were merely scarred. I sometimes wonder if he ever made the connection himself, if he ever realized in a sleepless night that his own hidden knowledge was the phantom in our midst, or if he simply believes, as the rest of the world would, that it was a bizarre, meaningless coincidence, a story to be told at parties for a nervous laugh. I will never know, and I will never ask. The Ouija board itself, I learned much later, was thrown out by Chloe's cleaning service, discarded with the other detritus of that party, a meaningless object that had served as the temporary housing for a profound and devastating insight. The market has crashed again since then, different triggers, different sectors, but the same visceral panic, the same stunned silence on trading floors, and each time, I feel a grim sense of validation, a confirmation that the cycle is eternal, that for every bubble there is a man like David who sees the pinprick of air escaping, but convinces himself it's just the wind. And for every crash there is a group like ours, fingers resting on the collective planchette of the market, feeling it move, with a will that seems supernatural, but is merely the aggregate of a million suppressed fears finally, catastrophically, expressing themselves. I am older now, the arrogant young banker a distant memory, and the city below my office is still a grid of ambition. But I see it for what it is. Not a kingdom to be conquered, but a nervous system, infinitely complex, firing signals of hope and dread. And my job is not to master it, but to listen to its whispers. To feel for the slightest, most deliberate tremors, forever haunted by the lesson that the most important data point is never on the screen, but in the quiet, terrified, and all too human heart. The memory of that night has crystallized now, not as a sharp pain, but as a deep, settled wisdom, a lodestone that has reoriented my entire moral and professional compass, aligning it not with the magnetic north of pure profit, but with the more chaotic, more truthful pole of human fallibility. And in my current life, far from the screaming headlines and the frantic pace of the trading floor, I find a strange peace in this understanding, a calm that comes from accepting the fundamental uncertainty of things, from knowing that the quest for perfect prediction is a fool's errand, and that the only edge one can truly have is the humility to acknowledge the whispers of doubt. I watch the financial news now with a sense of detachment, a quiet observer of the same cycles of mania and despair that have always governed the movement of capital, seeing the same archetypes we were. The young guns full of arrogant certainty, the cautious veterans with their unheeded warnings, playing out their roles on a global stage, and I no longer feel the urge to shout a warning from the sidelines, because I know that the lesson cannot be taught, it must be lived, it must be seared into the psyche by the cold touch of a planchette spelling out one's own doom. My own children are growing up in a world of digital abstractions, of cryptocurrencies and AI-driven investments, and I try to teach them, not about price-to-earnings ratios or technical analysis, but about intuition, about listening to that small, quiet voice inside that knows when something feels wrong, even when all the logic and all the experts say it's right, because that, in the end, is the only valuable inheritance I can pass on, the one thing the market can never crash, the truth that the most terrifying and valuable predictions don't come from algorithms or oracles, but from the parts of ourselves we are too afraid to acknowledge. The story of the Ouija board is my secret scripture, a text I reread in my mind every time I face a decision of consequence, and its central tenet remains unchanged, that the boundary between the rational and the uncanny is far thinner than we suppose, and that sometimes the only thing that can give voice to a truth too terrible to speak aloud is a child's game, guided by the trembling hand of a soul that already knows the score. The market will always rise and fall, fortunes will be made and lost, but the echo of that single word, crash, spelled out in the dim light of a party that feels a lifetime ago, is the one constant in my universe, a soundless bell that tolls only for me, a reminder that the greatest financial thriller ever written is not played out on the screens of Wall Street, but in the silent, hidden theater of the human heart, and we are all, always its protagonists, forever balancing on the knife's edge. between what we know and what we dare to believe. And so I move through the world now as a ghost of my former self, in the best possible way, unburdened by the crushing weight of certainty, my eyes open to the subtle currents of fear and desire that truly move the world, finding a perverse comfort in the chaos, a strange beauty in the inevitable collapse of every overinflated dream, because I see it not as an ending but as a correction, a return to a truth that was always there, whispering just beneath the surface, waiting for a moment of collective vulnerability to make itself known. I sometimes walk through the city at night, looking up at the towering citadels of finance, their windows glowing like 1,000 tiny Ouija boards, and I wonder what truths are being spelled out in the hushed conversations within, what suppressed anxieties are guiding the hands of the powerful, what inevitable crashes are being seeded in the dark, fertile soil of ignored intuition. The story is over, and yet it continues every day, in every boardroom and every trading desk and every anxious heart trying to decipher the future. And my role is no longer that of a player but of a witness, a keeper of the flame, a living testament to the fact that the most profound market forces are not numbers on a screen, but the unspoken fears and unacknowledged truths that reside within us all, and that sometimes the only way the universe can get our attention is to use a cheap toy to spell out, in letters we cannot ignore, the devastatingly simple fact that we already knew the answer all along. And in this final, quiet chapter of my life, the memory has softened into a single, enduring image that returns to me not with dread, but with a sense of completion. Often as I sit on my porch watching the evening settle over a much quieter landscape, the frantic energy of the city replaced by the patient rhythm of nature, it is the image of our hands, all 5 of them, resting on that plastic planchette, not as masters of our fate, but as conduits for a truth larger than any of us, a perfect metaphor for the market itself, a seemingly directed force that is, in reality, the product of countless individual pressures, each tiny unconscious tremor contributing to a movement that can feel fated supernatural, but is in the end profoundly and simply human. The arrogance of my youth has been sanded away by the relentless abrasion of experience, leaving behind a core of acceptance. And I see now that the real loss we suffered that year was not the money, which was substantial, but the illusion of control, the comforting lie that we were the smartest people in the room, that our models could tame the chaos, when in reality we were just 5 people in a room, fingers on a piece of plastic, participating in a mystery we were too proud to understand. The Ouija board did not predict the market crash. It revealed the crash that was already happening in the silent, unexplored territory of David's mind. And in doing so, it gave me the one thing that has proven more valuable than any bonus. The unshakable knowledge that the future is not a puzzle to be solved, but a story to be lived, a story written in the invisible ink of our own anxieties and intuitions, and that the only way to navigate it is not with blind faith in data, but with a courageous attention to the quiet, often inconvenient, truths that stir within us, the truths that, if we are brave enough to listen, can guide us safely through the inevitable crashes, not as victims of fate, but as students of our own profound and complicated selves. And so the story ends where it began, not with a bang but with a whisper, the whisper of a planchette moving across cardboard, a sound that has become the defining soundtrack of my life, a constant reminder that the most complex systems, whether the global market or the human psyche, are ultimately governed by simple, undeniable truths that we ignore at our peril. And as I sit here now, the years stretching behind me like a chart of volatile equities, I feel no bitterness, only a profound gratitude for the bizarre and brutal lesson that reshaped my existence, teaching me that the pursuit of wealth is a hollow goal if it is not paired with the pursuit of self-awareness, and that the greatest returns are not measured in dollars and cents, but in the hard-won wisdom that comes from accepting our own limitations, from listening to the gut feelings we so often dismiss, and from understanding that sometimes the most important messages are delivered not by experts or algorithms, but by the silent, collective intuition of our own haunted hearts, a truth that has become my only unshakable asset, the one thing that no market crash can ever take from me. The final, unspoken truth that has settled upon me with the weight of a stone is that we were not victims of a supernatural event or even of a simple financial misjudgment. We were participants in a profound act of psychological transference. A séance where the spirit we summoned was not from beyond the grave, but from the deepest, most rationalized recesses of our own professional minds. And the message it delivered was the one we had all collectively, silently agreed to ignore, making the entire episode not a chilling anomaly, but the most authentic moment of our careers. A moment of brutal, unvarnished clarity that the market itself, in its own chaotic way, was about to enact. This understanding has become my anchor, the core of a quiet philosophy that guides my remaining days. That every bubble, every crash, every period of irrational exuberance and blind panic is simply the macrocosm of that single night, a vast, collective Ouija board where millions of fingers rest on the planchette of price, each person contributing their own slight, unconscious pressure of hope or fear, their own suppressed knowledge or willful ignorance, until the pointer moves with a seeming will of its own, spelling out a future that feels inevitable, but was in fact written by the sum of all their silent, individual truths. I am an old man now, and the world of high finance I once inhabited is a foreign country, but the lesson of the board is timeless, and I see its principle echoed everywhere, in the rise and fall of political movements, in the spread of cultural trends, in the very way we love and fear and hope, all of them massive, seemingly directed forces that are, in the end, just the aggregation of countless tiny human tremors. So if you were to ask me now, after all these years, what I believe in, I would not speak of efficient markets or technical analysis. I would tell you that I believe in the ghost in the machine, and that the ghost is us, our own unacknowledged selves, and that the only wisdom worth having is the courage to listen to its voice, however it chooses to speak, even if it requires a child's game and a night of arrogant folly to make itself heard, a voice that forever whispers the same essential warning, that the greatest danger is not the unknown, but the truth we already know and are too afraid to face.